Hello, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Hello, Caribbean. Hello, world. Thank you for joining us for this very special edition of Page Turners Plus. Today we are speaking with Marcia Douglas, the author of one of my favorite novels of all time, The Marvellous Equations of the Dread, a novel in bass rhythm. Thank you for joining us, Marcia.
Thank you for having me.
No, Marcia is a writer. Apart from the fact that she is a writer, she is a professor of Caribbean literature and creative writing at the University of Boulder, Colorado. She was born in the United Kingdom. She was taken to Jamaica at age 6, where she remained until her teen years. She has lived in the United States, I believe, continuously since those teen years. Um, Marcia, your novel, The Marvelous Equation of the Dread, centers on Bob Marley. And I am Jamaican too, and this is a very important question for
Mhm.
people of our age who grew up with when Bob was alive.
Mm.
Um, where were you when you learned of Bob's death, and how did you react, and how did the people around you react?
Well, actually, when I learned of Bob's death, I was not in Jamaica. I was in the US, and it was um, a comment that I heard in passing. And because I was away from home, a young immigrant, it had this effect on me as I of it underscored the way in which I was feeling unrooted, unmoored, homeless even. Those are the sorts of feelings which came up for me when I heard the news. So, because of that, there's a way in which I've always felt that I have unfinished business with Bob. And so you might say that there's a way in which many years later, writing this book is in part me processing some of that unfinished business, so to speak. Um, and I would also say that I feel that there's similarly a sense in which maybe Jamaica has had unfinished business with Bob because he did um, pass away at such a young age and quite suddenly, I would say. And so there's a lot there for us to look back on and to retrieve and to process. And, there's something of the imagination and creativity which allows us to do that.
Well, I can say I remember exactly where I was when I
Really.
heard it. And I think most people our age remember exactly where they were. I
Mm-hmm.
was in school,
Mm-hmm.
and when we heard the news, because I don't even remember how we heard the news, but the
Mm-hmm.
news spread across the school.
Yeah.
And for the first few minutes, we walked around looking dazed.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody started singing, and the
Mm-hmm.
entire school erupted in song.
Wow.
So that is why I know the kind of impact
Yeah.
that news had on people our age.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to invite the rest of the panel to come in. Anybody with a question um, could come
Yeah,
in.
I just have a question based on what Marcia just I hope I could call you Marcia just mentioned. She said that she felt that Jamaica had unfinished business with Bob. Is that was that sort of the deciding factor in you bringing or returning Bob to Jamaica in the form of Fall Down or the Fallen Angel?
As a fallen angel specifically.
Yes.
Right. Well, having Bob return in the form of a fallen angel had it allowed for certain things to happen in the narrative. For one, Bob returns, but he's not recognizable. He's stripped of all of his glamour and his fame, and he's ordinary. And, there is an aspect of the book which is concerned, interested in this notion of missed opportunity or missed gates, or those things which actually are right in front of us, but which we fail to perceive, this notion of open secrets. And so Bob functions in that way, you might say, when he returns as in the skin, in the physical structure of Fall Down. This way in which sometimes the message is right in front of us, but we don't get it. So it allowed for that to play out in the narrative, with using Fall Down as this homeless person, somebody nondescript and simple, and who could very easily be overlooked. And also from Bob's perspective, it allowed him to look out on this evolving and modern Jamaica, without, almost in this invisible sort of way, and to observe what's unfolding.
May I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Uh, and this comes from what you just said about the evolving
Yeah.
Jamaica. I was interested in the way that Bob coming back in the body of Fall Down,
Yeah.
how he was perceiving dancehall.
How he was
And
what?
yeah, how he was perceiving dancehall
Oh, yeah.
as a music.
Right.
And for those of us who are interested in music and know a little bit about the history of music,
Yeah.
dancehall is a derivative
Yeah.
of reggae. It's
Yeah.
interesting that Bob wouldn't recognize it as so. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to trace something of the way in which music has evolved, from maybe Bob's time until more recent times. And I was, trying to put myself something of in his brain, and what his, he was a very, very spiritual roots reggae type of individual. And that's something of his psyche. And so I'm putting myself in his mind, and his concerns, and what he was immersed in, obsessed with, and thinking about the ways in which maybe he might react to how music has evolved and changed, or the way in which maybe certain musical styles have come to be more emphasized over time. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No,
Uh,
that's good. I just want some insight
Yeah.
because I thought that was really interesting.
And
Also on this subject, sorry, of music, since we're there,
Yeah.
um, did the does the music, the fact you call this a novel in bass rhythm,
Yes.
apart from the fact that Bob was a musician,
Yeah.
does the music have any particular significance to the novel?
Yeah, definitely. Music is everything in this novel. Music, the bass rhythm, has the power to call back the dead. Not only does Bob Marley return, but Queen Nanny returns, Marcus Garvey returns, and many other figures return also. Some famous, or not so famous, but this is a fabulous, fabulous world. And the music, the bass rhythm, it goes underground, and it has this power to call back the dead. The dead, they are, via the music, they are in tune with something of the sufferation of the people, you might say. And the music calls them back. I'm also using music in the book too. I'm writing the book out of what you might call a reggae aesthetic. And so I'm using notions such as reverb, remix, um, version, echo, as literary devices, or as structuring devices in the novel. So, for instance, I'm using version to as a device in which there are stories within stories, and there are different ways of telling stories. There are different versions of one story. The novel also has what I call a dub side, and I always think of music as dub music as something which is, it has this sort of trance-like effect. You listen to it and you can go into a zone. And so it felt to me that the dub side would be a perfect space, a space of spirit. And it's also the space in the novel where Selassie and Bob Marley meet in the afterlife. Um, and then, I'm also using something such as uh, reverb. And a good example of that, I would say, is the word mama in the novel, for instance. There is this story of a slave child who calls out mama just as her mother is being pushed into the Atlantic. And that word mama reverbs throughout the novel all the way until the very end when Angela calls out mama. Those are some examples of some of the ways in which I'm using, these. I'm using reggae as something of an aesthetic, and I'm using something of the structures and of reggae to organize the novel. So, and then of course, I'm also interested in how reggae comes to be intertwined and in conversation with Rastafari, and how that informs something of the world view of the book, thinking through Zion and Babylon and so on. So, in answer to your question, Paula, reggae is the world of this book.
Kessel
Thank
was
you.
trying to come in, so go ahead.
No. This is such a wonderful, rich conversation. Thank you so much. I'm kind of bouncing off that conversation, but also something you said slightly earlier. In the novel, one of the people you call back is a woman who can't remember her own name, who's one of the forgotten women. Um,
Right.
and it was such a powerful moment because obviously there are the most of the women in history are the ones that we forget, right? It's the women that aren't princesses or queens. They don't
Yeah.
live in fancy places. Their memories and their lives are not recorded particularly well. So for
Yeah.
the woman to forget her own name, I just thought was really captured that, right? We're so forgotten that even we don't know our name. And I
Right.
just kind of wondered, not the why, because I think I understand the why, but like I think the question I wanted to ask was how important was it to you to include those women that are actually really difficult as a historian for us to find generally, but you found a way to include her really seamlessly in your novel, and I just wondered why that was so important to you.
Yeah. At the center of this book, Bob is often seen as the center of the book, and he's this famous icon. But there's also a way in which I wanted to render the book equally the domain of other voices as well, particularly women's voices. And you bring up the woman whose name can't be remembered. She's one of them. And, maybe people who didn't necessarily make history, but they're very much a part of our identity and our history. I would, Lena has a name, and she's one of them. I would put her in that category also. She's a fictional character, but it felt important to have a woman in particular as something of the axis of the book. And there are other women too, such as the one you mentioned, the woman who can't even remember her name, who swirl around her as well as a female figure in the book. There's also Sister Vaughan, and there's Angela. They're the three Nyabingi Rasta women drummers as well, Morva, Willa, and Dawn. All of those I see as anchoring the book. And it is as much their story as it is Bob's story. That felt really important. Lena, she begins and ends the book, and it felt important to begin and end the book via something of a woman's perspective. So that's how I'm working with the women figures.
Was that more than your attempt to be inclusive, or was it more a pushback against patriarchy?
Yes, definitely a pushback against patriarchy. And I feel that Lena, as a character, she often challenges Bob. They have this sort of light flirtation going on between them, but she also pushes and picks at him as well. She says, "Don't think that every nice girl wants you," that kind of thing. And she questions, some of the assumptions that he makes. And as I said, there's a way in which this is really her story, because even though we get Bob, often it is via her lens, and she controls the narrative. And a lot is sometimes said of Rasta women and the place that they hold, and it really felt important to portray her as this strong Rasta woman who is in control of the narrative and who guides it in many ways. So that was something which was very decided on my part. And if you follow the other female characters in the book, you'll also see that it is a young girl, Tensi, who takes the drum and the lead in the spirit yard. And at the end of the book, it is also a young girl who throws the first stone at the clock. So all of those decisions were very important narrative bits and pieces that I put in place there.
No, I think there was a certain magic in recalling, I think, the voices of women in a space that, like you say, looks on the surface to be dominated by men. You've got some huge iconic characters in this book. You have Marcus Garvey, you have the Emperor Haile Selassie, you have Bob Marley. Which woman can compete with any of them on the world stage? But yet somehow you found a way to do that. And I think it's remarkable that amongst the characters that you draw, you also have space for the women that we don't know their names and we possibly never will, but who I think I would argue do make history. I think that's kind of what's interesting about the woman whose name you don't remember.
Yeah.
Because actually, it's the women that we don't see behind the scenes who are often shaping the events that we hear of, that make those other big things possible.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I think that's why it's so special what you do, because she comes back when the other ancestors are coming back, and she doesn't know her name. We don't know her name, but we know that without her, none of the rest is possible.
Right.
I think, and so it's wonderful that you've done that, and thank you for kind of explaining why.
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. That woman, she talks about how she has cooked and planted and sown, and similarly, there's Queen Nanny. I want to mention that as well, who is a big part of that whole spirit yard dialogue. And I do manage to get in Marcus Garvey's two wives, who were both called Amy and Amy. He says, my. And so, I don't go off into their lives, but it felt important to mention the Amys behind Marcus Garvey.
Then and there was this, sorry.
Yeah, Rita is there too.
Yes, she is. And even a character who looks like somebody who was a beauty queen. But anyway, I wanted to mention that one of the powerful moments, the more powerful moments in the novel, was that exchange between Bob and Lena, where Bob says, "What if God is a woman?" And Lena says, "She is."
Yeah.
So but since we're on Lena, how important was Lena's deafness to the creation of that character?
Well, Lena's deafness, in a novel which is so sound aware. Lena's deafness comes to be emphasized. And the way in which I'm using Lena as a deaf woman is that she doesn't hear the music in an auditory way, but she feels it, and she enables us to understand or overstand, higher stand that music is something which is not just heard, but which can be felt in every fiber of your being. That's how she experiences music. There's this moment when Bob is singing and she puts her hand on his chest and she feels the music, and she says that it was the most irritating. And so she experiences music in this very sentient way. um, the other thing about Lena is that she is deaf, but she finds ways to survive and she finds ways to innovate as well. She creates what she calls a Rasta woman language. She calls it deaf woman, you know, and there's something of her innovation, and the way in which she finds ways to survive, which you know also, as I was saying early, positions her as a very powerful woman, and something of a leader as well. And I in the book, I really don't want to romanticize or idealize Rastafari in any way. However, I do feel that Rastafari, it's this community of innovators and trailblazers, and very creative individuals. And Lena emerges as a woman leader in that sort of way, in the way in which she navigates deafness, and the way in which her differently abledness becomes something of almost an asset, I would say.
Eric, do you have anything you would like to ask at this point?
Well, yeah, of course. And speaking about Lena, and her daughter, the relationship between her and her daughter, what's this? Was there any significance about her name?
Angela's name.
Yes.
Yes. Well, there is significance in her name because Angela's conception is a bit mysterious, but it's hinted at that it has something to do with the fallen angel, right? And so there's something of her name which is intertwined with angelness and jajaness and all of those sorts of all of those sorts of concepts. So Angela is something of a gift, and she's also a representative of the youth, of which the novel is so very concerned,
Okay, thank you.
and therefore the future.
Okay.
So her voice will continue to reverb.
Mm, thank you.
Raul J, you've been quiet, so I'd like to invite you in.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on the whole, Lena conversation, because in many popular culture references, and in many circles, Bob was seen as, a ladies' man. Some might call it a womanizer, but here you have Lena, sort of rejecting his advances, humbling him in a sense. Do you think that was sort of a deliberate on your part to make it seem like, it's not every woman that he could have gotten, or there are women who are out there who could resist the temptation? Was there like a political statement in that, or anything like that?
Yeah, I would say all of the above that you've mentioned. Again, I wanted to, Bob. I wanted to decenter Bob a little bit, right? And Lena, with her character, her personality, her questioning, she enables some of that to happen. Um, yeah, so she helps us to I didn't want to bring Bob on the scene as this star, um um whether he's in fall down skin or not. I wanted it to be a space where maybe we could critique him a bit, right? And also using Bob to also simultaneously critique something of the dynamics in Jamaican society as well.
So, Paula, if I could just get in here, I think this a good follow-up question would be, which is the more important character, Bob or Jamaica, the nation of Jamaica?
The nation of Jamaica. That's an easy for me to answer. The book is dedicated to for the healing of the nations, and I am really interested here in celebrating Jamaica in its richness and beauty, and also exploring, its exploring its suffering and its struggle as well, and not only that, but also exploring solutions too. So for the healing of the nation, I'm reaching for solutions, and one of the solutions that the novel puts forward is nurturing the youth. Nurturing the youth. The youth are the hope for our future. Another solution which the novel is interested in is coming into our own personal and communal greatness as well, reaching for Zion mind rather than bad mind. Those sorts of solutions. Um, I think that it's easy to write a story that simply explores the violence and the poverty and the distress and all of that. But I wanted to do that while simultaneously bringing into the conversation the ways in which we can dialogue and heal as well. And so it does land very decidedly on um, this invitation to embrace and nurture the youth in particular.
Would it be unfair of me to suggest that another solution that you propose through the novel is reaching backwards as well as looking forwards? That is the way that the ancestors come is suggesting that by looking backwards, there's a strength to be gained there, but it doesn't have to be an uncritical look back, right? We see Bob Marley challenge Marcus Garvey on how he thought about how he described and called and announced the emperor as a coward. So it's not an unquestioning critical reaching back, but there is a reaching back that can be powerful as well. Is that unfair reading, or is that just my historian's head whirring away and making assumptions about what you're trying to do in the novel?
No, you're right on target. I'm thinking about the whole notion of Sankofa and this way in which it behooves us to return to the past and retrieve what is found there for as we move forward into the future. So certainly, and that's part of the whole impulse of the book is looking back at Bob, right? And then using all of these historical characters, named and unnamed, to also to look back and move us forward, to carry us forward from this present moment, and as we come to reimagine something of a new present and a new future. So yeah, you nailed it.
Well, I would like to ask, in conjunction with that question that Keswa just asked, as the other historian on this panel, and an Africanist at that, um, the place of Africa, and of course, Rastafari, and the place of Africa is central, definitely, in
Yeah.
terms of the cosmology and the philosophy. Um, but what I was struck with in reading the text was that you didn't put Africa as peripheral.
Mm.
I believe just as much as Jamaica is central, Africa is also central. I mean, I don't know if you would perceive it the same way as the writer than
Mm.
I as the reader.
Yeah. Yeah, Africa is central. And Marcus Garvey helps us dialogue and think through some of that with his back to Africa ideas and movement. Um, I was interested in, also the notion of back to Africa and how that engages with the notion of Zion as well. And in writing this book and preparing for it, researching it, I had a lot of conversations with people in the Rasta community asking, what does Zion mean to you? And I thought that the answers would be more uniform. Some people, some Rastas said Africa. Some people said they're not sure, which was very interesting to me. When put on the spot, they thought about it and they said no. I remember one person said to me, "Go and ask Muta," meaning Muta Baruka. And but the responses that really resonated for me were those responses which were along the lines of Zion is both a physical space and a spiritual space. And this is really what the book is concerned with, is this notion of Zion as being a spiritual place as well, this spiritual Africa. So there is a physical Africa that one can return to, but there's also the notion of a spiritual Africa as well. And to me, that felt the most powerful and also the most readily accessible and also the most healing as well. Because many of us will never make it back to a physical Africa as such. However, there is this way in which we can transcend. We can move beyond some sort of whatever limitations we have and enter into a spiritual Zion. So that might be why you might not experience Africa as a physical place as necessarily centered within the novel, because I'm interested in expanding that and transcending beyond that notion to something else also.
There are three characters in the novel, three of the children, aged between 10 and 11 years, who
Yeah.
commit shocking acts of violence.
Yeah.
And Bob approaches them in very much the same way he approaches the children who are just ordinary children who don't do anything extraordinary or atrocious. And he says to these children, "You're young enough to know better." Could you talk us through your thoughts on just that?
Yeah. I think the passage that you're referring to is, I think it's called Lane or something like that,
Yes, yes.
right?
Lane
Yeah.
Youth.
Lane Youth, right? And Lane Youth, it's this segment where there are these young boys and they've committed other atrocious acts, but in the present moment of that passage, they are scheming to commit some violence against a young girl. Bob intercedes, and that's when he makes that comment, "You're young enough to know better." And by that, he means that as youth, they are they are positioned with a certain amount of power and promise, which they can tap into, but which they at that moment are not fully attuned to and don't fully realize. What he does after that is that he shows them this vision of the past and of their former self, a former life in which they were slaves, and the young girl they're about to commit violence against was also a slave. And it was a life in which they betrayed her for favor from the master, who, in return for betraying her, gave them a bit of salt pork. And in that moment, Bob doesn't say anything. He just shows them this vision of the past. It's one of these Sankofa moments, you might say, you know. And in seeing this replay of the past, they get it and they're ashamed. You know, they taste the salt pork in their mouth and they spit it out because it is the taste of their betrayal. And so, you know, Bob doesn't say very much throughout this whole episode. He just shows them what happens. And it's this message of, you know, this invitation to let go of this mental slavery, let go of the past, and likewise again, see what is found there and move forward with more self-awareness and enter into a greatness. So that's what I'm trying to do in that passage, just via the vision of the past and the replay of the past.
Roger, I'm going to invite you in because I haven't heard a lot from you today.
Yeah, so just based on that, you know, it seems as if this is a book of the 1970s and 1980s as much as it is a book of now,
Yeah.
essentially, because you're saying that it takes the younger generation to change a lot of the things that we see in our societies, and that's a message that a lot of people are saying now, especially with politicians, that the current batch of politicians we have won't change much, but it's the younger generation that you have, who would be able to change a lot of that. But I just wanted to ask another question. So the Angel's Ledger book says, and I'm quoting here, sanity can be both asymmetrical and symmetrical. Likewise, madness can also be both asymmetrical and symmetrical. Two related sides of different tunes. Talk us through these ideas.
Yeah, that's a very fall down quote. He likes to run in circles a little bit. And from the world view of fall down, symmetry is equated to sanity, and asymmetry is equated to madness. And he is aware that symmetry is something in society which is valued, right? It's a certain aesthetic, you might say. And so, in that quote that you're using there, it's another very convoluted, roundabout way of saying that we actually need a little bit of madness in our sanity and a little bit of sanity in our madness. And, there's something of the asymmetry is also another aesthetic that I'm interested in exploring as well in my creativity, where I'm interested in chaos. But you do need to bring a little bit of balance to the chaos as well. I'm interested in mashing things up a bit and making them more edgy and deviating from the streamlined, and with experimenting with a narrative and with a creative space. So I'm very much interested myself, like Fall Down, with something of an asymmetrical aesthetic, which feels a little bit mad and out of control, at times, but I feel that that's where, you take some risks and where something very interesting can emerge.
I just want to go off on a little tangent here because I don't want us to lose time and not get to it, because one of the characters I found most fascinating was Red Ear, who only makes cameo appearances in the novel.
Yeah.
And she spells her name the Jalexic way. Now, my interpretation in the non-Jalexic interpretation of the spelling of her name is that her name translates to reader.
Yeah.
And what fascinates me about her is that she is completely unmoved by Bob's approaches. And she also doesn't change. Everybody else ages each time Bob comes out of the clock, but she never ages. She remains the same.
Yeah.
And he also leaves His Majesty's ring with Red Ear.
Yeah.
So tell me about Red Ear, because she only made some cameo appearances, but she's fascinating. So tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she is reader, and she's unchanging. And the fact that she's unchanging means that each time Bob comes out of the clock tower, she's the one, as you say, who never ages. She might have different clothes and hair, but she's always the same age and always reading the book. The fact that she never changes means that there's a way in which she anchors the book. She's something of this touchstone, you might say, and the thing that always reminds that, okay, things have changed, but yes, this is the same place. So that's one function. So she's a device in that way. But as you say, she's not particularly moved by Bob. She's in that way, she's akin to Lena in that she's not starstruck by him. She's like, I'm reading my book even though he's in it, but she's really wrapped up in the book. She's more interested in the book than she is by Bob, who is physically right there, even though he's in the book. So, she's very engaged with the book. I also mean to say something about reading as well in this sort of meta way, about what it means to engage with a book and something of the power of literature as well. So that's me sort of sliding that in there just a little bit. The fact that she's wrapped in the book and engaged with it. But Red Ear is also reader, and I'm also engaging with the reader as well. And in the end, she is given the ring, and which is to say that she too is she's invited to engage with the ring and with its power, and something is being invested in her. She has a certain responsibility ultimately at the end, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but we have run out of time. You are going to see Marcia reading a pre-recorded excerpt from the Marvelous Equations of the Dread. Until we see you next time, take care. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us, Marcia.
Thank you. I am reading from the Marvelous Equations of the Dread, the section Boy with a Water Gun in His School Bag. There are many child voices in this novel, and this is one of them. See me here, standing at the bus stop, and I don't really want to go to school because I was too hungry last night to study my 7 times. And today, Miss going to make us recite it. Government say not to beat us, but Miss have a ruler. And sometimes if you don't careful, you feel it sting your shoulder. I have a play gun in my school bag. It look real, and come recess, I going to shoot myself with it. Anyway, I standing at the bus stop thinking on the gun. when a man bent down and start clean my shoes. Quick time I move and say, what you doing? And he say, just cool. And he take out a brush and start shine my shoes. Same so, like it's that he born for. He look up at me and say, 7 is a number in arithmetic. And it's like he read my mind and know all my worries, just like that. The brush have some bristles that massage under my skin. And he shine and shine, and I don't want him stop. For each time he move the brush is like me make from the number 7. Every little bit of me come in 7s. 7 is the number of greatness, him say. And me feel the number 7 just a multiply inside me, past 7 times everything. And it's like me going on too. The numbers can't stop. No end to the number 7, no end to my greatness, and ever sound that tremble like an electric guitar string. 7 is the number of greatness, the man say again. You feel how great you is? And the greatness don't stop. It just a multiply and multiply. And it go all the way out to a place don't have no edge that make from the same thing that sound make from, where belly laugh come from, and music and baby cry. I start to cry too, and the cry turn into a laugh, and the laugh can't stop. It just multiply like the 7s. And when the man finished shine my shoes, the little maps at his ears jingling on and on like a dub thing. And he say, that's how great you is. I late, but I go to school in time for Miss and her 7 times drill. Miss call on everybody 1-1. And when she get to me, she point with her ruler and she say, 7 times 7? And I say, 49, miss. Miss, do you know the number 7 is the number of greatness? For by now I can carry 7 to the place of arithmetic. For is like I fill with more than stars in the sky. And it's like the good thing I fill with can't stop. It go on, and I know all the numbers. I just counting them like Lucky Jack 7s. My uncle is a 7-day Adventist, but their 7 don't multiply. It's stop and start again. This 7 go on and on like a cup of water that have no bottom, like shine things in the sky that can't count, like a pomegranate that can never run out of seeds. Every time you spit one out, you find more, like playing in soap water and the bubbles coming up. I get to find me is the number 7, multiplied over and over. No end to me, no stopping me. And no matter what Miss ask, is me the number, me the factor, me the product, me the answer. Miss coming back down the row of desks, and when she get to me again, she said, 7 times 12? And I say, 84. Then I look at her and I say, but miss, 84 really too small for how great I am and how great you is. And Miss look at me like she want faint. And she said, but Jesus.